I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, a father's invitation to love, honesty, and freedom. I am speaking with an amazing individual with an incredibly powerful story. He has lived the life of two fathers. With his first son, Jay, born shortly after he was incarcerated for second-degree murder, he experienced the regret of his own mistakes and the disconnection caused by a society that sees Black lives as disposable. With his second, Seiku, born after his release, he has experienced healing, transformation, intimacy, and the possibilities of a world where men and boys can openly show one another affection, support, and love. Shaka Senghor is the New York Times bestselling author of Righting My Wrongs: Life, Death, and Redemption in an American Prison. He's a leading voice on criminal justice reform, a tech investor, a lecturer at universities, and the head of diversity, equality, and inclusion at Trip Actions, a travel management and expense startup. He's a former MIT Media Lab Directors Fellow, a former fellow in the inaugural class of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation Community Leadership Network, and a member of Oprah Winfrey's Super Soul 100. In the decade since his release from prison, Senghor has started and worked with nonprofit seeking to lift people up, visited the White House, been interviewed by Trevor Noah and Oprah Winfrey, and given award-winning TED Talks, all with the goal of building a more inspired, just, and fulfilling future. He has written a new book, Letters to the Sons of Society. In this collection of beautifully written letters to Jay and Seiku, the book traces Shaka's journey as a Black man in America and unpacks the toxic and misguided messages about masculinity, mental health, love, and success that boys learn from an early age. He issues a passionate call to all fathers and sons, fathers who don't know how to show their sons love, sons who are navigating a fatherless world, boys who have been forced to grow up before their time, to cultivate positive relationships with their men, seek healing, tend to mental health, grow from pain, and rewrite the story that has been told about them. Letters to the Sons of Society is a soulful examination of the bond between father and sons and a touchstone for anyone seeking a kinder, more just world. It was truly an honor to speak with him, to hear his story, and I was moved and deeply inspired. I hope you will enjoy this interview as much as I did. Please enjoy. Shaka, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be here and can't wait to just dive into this great conversation with you.
I know. I absolutely loved this book. Honestly, I didn't know what to expect from it, but it was so moving, touching, inspirational, so honest and vulnerable. I really loved the soft, vulnerable aspect of it, especially coming from someone who's been incarcerated for almost 20 years, this tough guy, right? It's beautiful. And I love that it's written in this form of letters. Yeah. I mean, I think we're almost the same generation. We love letters,
Yeah.
And you have a really beautiful passage here. I'm going to read it, but I just love the format of it, how you address to both of your sons. This book is written for them, but not only for them. Sorry, I'm getting confused. So first of all, congratulations, yet another successful book.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about the book, and, being able to write it in the form of letters was very intimate, very personal, really resonated with who I am as a dad, who I am as a person. And it's truly inspired by the letters I received from my dad. As you mentioned, we're from that generation where letters matter. And having given my experience of being incarcerated for nearly 2 decades, letters was truly a lifeline to a world outside of prison. And, my dad is a beautiful letter writer, really thoughtful man. And I think his experience with writing letters started with him being in the Air Force. So he went into the Air Force when he was about 17 years old, and he had to write letters home. And so, when I was incarcerated, I didn't even know what in regards to how I would be supported by my family. But from the moment I was incarcerated, my dad began to write me these letters, and it really inspired the book and the tone of the book as I thought about, what is the legacy I want to leave to my 2 sons, and as an extension of that, the sons of society and the people who care about them.
Yeah, here I'm going to read a small passage about letters from your book. Letters are magical objects, and I urge you to both send them, lots of them, and ask to receive them. Unlike email or text or whatever the next technology will be, letters remain. They are solid, like the trees from which the paper they're written on is made. You can look back on them years and years from now and see who you were and who you wanted to be. You'll see more clearly who the person writing to you was back then and who he or she wanted to be. You can write to your younger self or to the old man you will one day be, using letters as checkpoints to track your development. Heck, you might even create a great passion, and on and on. And I just love it. I personally write letters, collect letters, send them, receive them. But this reminded me of this treasure, that this magic of letter writing is. And I have letters from my dad that I recently opened. He passed away last year. And it's so interesting to connect to that point in time. It just transports you to a completely different place in time. And right, it's a very sensual experience.
Yeah, it truly is. And first of all, condolences on the transition of your dad. I'm really excited to hear that you're fortunate to have his letters. I think dads have so much to share, oftentimes that doesn't get vocalized, but through the written word is truly special when you have that treasured gift of having those letters. And I still have all of my dad's letters as well. And, when I read them now and I think about when he was writing them, he was around my age. And so I think about the man I am and the man he was back then. And it's just something special to hear the way that he thought about the world, to hear the way that he thought about parenting, the struggles he's overcame, the victories he's had, the way he loves family and he talks about family. And I'm able to see that in how he shows up in the world. And I just hope that other dads will think about, the impact that writing a letter can have on their children, or a series of letters can have on their children, because it's just an opportunity to memorialize who we are in the moment, the world that we're in, but also just to give them a sense of what life is like in a day-to-day, in those mundane moments, the more exciting moments, and, what our dreams are for our children and what our hopes are for them. So just truly a special gift for any parent or any person to give to another person. So I'm really excited that it's being received in the way that it is so far.
Yes. And you're right. Sometimes it's so hard to say certain things to certain people while we communicate. But when you write a letter, you can let your guard down. You can be more open and vulnerable and more intimate. And I know from those letters that my dad wrote to me when I was young, and it was a traumatic time in my life, and I was separated from my dad. But the lessons he's teaching me in those letters, or the things he's telling me, the way he loves me or shows certain things, I think it's deep. It's a whole different level of intimacy through letters.
Absolutely. And when I think about the history of letters that were written, I think about some of the great books that really inspired me at different points in my life. And that intimacy that you speak of is something that's really sacred and divine in a way, when you think about someone pouring out their soul and pouring out their heart and really hoping that their message is received in love and in the light that is sent. So, I'm always excited, even at this point in my life, to get a letter. And I don't send them as much as I used to. I'm incredibly busy right now, but I'm really excited to get back to letter writing. And I've been really fortunate. My youngest son, he's always writing me these beautiful, inspirational, and affirming notes. And it really means a lot to me.
Yeah. Well, so let's go to the story. You are in solitary confinement and you receive a letter from your son. You received many letters, and I'm going to address a few of them. But I want to ask you first about the letter you received from your son that changed something in you, had a big, big impact.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And I originally wrote about that letter in my first major published book, Righting My Wrongs, Life, Death, Redemption in an American Prison. And the story that I really tell, and I wanted to, re-establish the importance of that story, was I was in solitary confinement. At that time, I ended up serving 4.5 years. And my son wrote me this letter. And he had, my dad would always sit him down. They would write letters at the same time, and my dad would mail them to me. But this letter was different. It was the first time that my son had addressed, what he discovered about my imprisonment. His mother had told him that I was actually in prison, but she also told him what I was in prison for. And when he wrote me this letter and laid out for me what she had shared with him, it was devastating, as a dad, to think about this little boy learning that his father was in prison for murder. And what it did is it really grounded me in understanding what my responsibility was as a father and as a man, and what I owed him, which was to show up in the world despite my circumstances as the best possible version of myself, so that my son would understand that, anybody can have a fall from grace. Anybody can have a moment that is less than stellar, a moment that is tragic in all its implications. And yet, if they dig deep, if they are willing to put the work in, that they can come out on the other side of that moment as a better human being, and that they can come out with a sense of purpose and a way to model resiliency. What happens when you have a fall from grace? How do you pick yourself up? How do you start anew? Even when the world is telling you you're not worthy of that, but being able to do the hard work of finding self-worth enough to know that you can lead by example and contribute to somebody else's growth.
So how long have you been in prison at that time when you received that letter? How many years it was?
I think I had been in prison around 10 and a half to 11 years, because he was still really young. He was about 10 or 11 years old. So I had been in prison all of his life, though.
Wow. I know you went to prison when he was born, right?
Yeah. So when I was arrested, my oldest son, Jay's mom, she was 3 months pregnant. And so he was born 6 months after my arrest.
Yeah. And what did he write? I want you to say it, what he wrote in his own words, which I think is so powerful.
Yeah, in that letter, he said to me, "Dad, my mom told me why you're in prison for murder." And he said, "Dad, don't kill again. Jesus watches what you do." And at that time, and even now, I wasn't a religious person. I'm very spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something powerful and beautiful about a child recognizing that there's a divine force that's greater than our human existence that we should be thinking about, as we navigate life. And that was a really grounding moment for me.
Another interesting letter you received, I think, was, and I am shifting the story a little bit, but I think we'll get to that, was from a woman who was related to the man that you shot. Can you tell me about that letter too? I think that's also very powerful.
Yeah, that was one of the other letters that I received that had a profound impact on my life. About 6 years into my incarceration, a woman named Nancy reached out to me, and she was the godmother of David, the man whose life I'm responsible for taking. And she wrote me this powerful letter that really laid out for me the man that David was, the father, the friend, the son. And what she said to me in that letter was that, as disheartening and as heartbreaking as it is to know that I caused his death, she actually forgave me. And not only did she forgive me, but she loved me, because that's what God would want her to do. And, again, the power of a human being extending the grace of forgiveness, was something that really shifted, a lot inside of me. And at the time I got that letter, I wasn't emotionally or spiritually mature enough to even understand the power of that gift, and that I needed that. I didn't even know that I even needed that. And, one of the things that I try to help people understand is that when you are a perpetrator of a crime, like, you can't reach out to the family member until they reach out to you. And so it took 6 years for me to even be able to apologize in a meaningful and a heartfelt way, because I couldn't reach out to the family first. But once she reached out, we began to correspond. And she really was just an incredibly thoughtful woman, and a true reflection and example of what it means to be human, because she didn't look at me as this monster. She recognized that I was a 19-year-old kid who had experienced, tons of trauma that had shaped and informed, the decision I made that night. And she really sought to understand what had happened, in my life to lead me down that path. And that's something I'll never forget.
So you did respond, and you had some other correspondence with her.
Absolutely. Yeah. We corresponded for probably about 10 or so years. And we just recently lost contact in recent times, but she's getting older in age, and so yeah, we just don't correspond in the way that we used to.
What do you think made her write that letter? Is it usual or unusual to do that in general?
I mean, I can't speak for other people's experience, because typically, when you're navigating your worst moment in life, it's hard to share that. And so a lot of the men I was incarcerated with wasn't as open with sharing their worst moment. And, I can't speak for what her actual inspiration was. I can tell you what I think it was, which was, centered in her spiritual beliefs about humanity. And, that's something that it really inspired me to think about even the people who had harmed me throughout my life, and to find a way to forgive those people, and recognize that in forgiving those, I was really liberating a part of me that was held hostage by those traumatic events.
So when she forgave you and she offered you love, that enabled you to forgive yourself. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's something that, we don't talk enough about, the importance of self-forgiveness and the role that it plays in our overall happiness and fulfillment. I think it was really important for me to be able to say, I'm sorry for some of the things that I had done that was, self-harm, and to be able to contextualize it with all of the elements that led to those thoughts, which, a lot of times we don't extend that level of grace to ourselves or others. We don't take the time to really understand how our decisions are typically the result of other inputs that oftentimes we're not responsible for, but they impact the decisions we make that we are responsible for.
I want to go back to your childhood now because you experienced trauma upon trauma throughout your life. You were 11 years old, I think, when your parents split up, right?
Yes, I was 11 when my dad and my mom separated for the first time, and then they kind of embarked on this journey, which many parents I've learned over the years have done, which is to separate, get back together, separate, and then they eventually divorced. And that was devastating, for our family. Up until that point, all we had known was the stability of having a mother and father. And, my dad was a great balancing energy in our household. And years later, when I separated from my youngest son, Sekou's mom, it was equally devastating, to know that our family was breaking apart. But the difference, I think, between what my experience was as a child and my son's experience is that Sekou's mom and I decided to consciously co-parent and to really be intentional about our co-parenting relationship and how we show up, for our son.
I watched that TEDx talk the two of you do. It's so poetic and beautiful, Ebony and your son's mom, about your story and how you co-parent. And I work with people who go through divorce. I teach co-parenting classes and I help people. I'm a divorce mediator. That's what I do, help co-parents get along and resolve conflicts and be the best that they can. And yesterday I shared that video. I'm going to put it on my website as a resource. It's so beautiful and moving, and it shows what's possible, that divorce doesn't have to be so acrimonial. You can co-parent, not divorce. Co-parenting doesn't have to be so cutthroat, and you can co-parent, and not in all cases, but I think this is a good example to show people what's possible. Sometimes people need to hear those kind of inspirational stories. I sent that to two of my clients yesterday, and I'm going to put it on my website. And of course, I'll link it in the show notes. I think it's really moving and beautiful. But you said, your father remained this powerful force in your life when you were in prison, and he wrote to you for all those years. And you said that, there was stability in your home, but there was also abuse, right? From your mom. Can you talk about that a little bit? I think it's so important to highlight that part, what children don't get from their homes. Visibly from outside, the family could be intact. Mom and dad look stable. They have clothes. Your dad got you those Air Jordans. I love that Snickers story. But what children don't get is that emotional warmth, attunement, connection, right? What were you looking for? What were you not getting from your mom?
Yeah, that's a great question. Over the years, I've been able to think more about what happened to my mother as opposed to what my mother did. And it's always very complex because, my mother is still alive and she's still on her human journey, as we all are. And I would never want to box her into past moments in a way that society tends to box people into their worst moments. So what I learned about my mother is that my mother had went through a series of traumatic events in her own life, and it shaped the way that she parented. It shaped the way that she navigated the world, and contextualizing it also with the social realities of raising Black boys in America, which oftentimes in Black households can be very fear-based parenting. The narrative is that I would rather punish you in the household so that society doesn't punish you. But unfortunately, what happens is that punishment and alienation leads children to flee the home in search of a more accepted sense of what it means to be family. And that's what I did. I ran away from a household that was very conflict oriented and abusive in the truest sense of that word. But I also understand as a dad now and as an adult, why my mother did some of the things that she did, and it doesn't excuse what happened. And my father was also complicit in that. I think the difference between my relationship with my mom and my dad is that my father was very open to expressing the areas of weaknesses that he exhibited during those difficult times. And with my mother, it required a little bit more work because, she had to go back and revisit painful memories from her childhood. And what I would say to any parent, as we're thinking about how to raise our children, is the things that hurt you in your childhood, like you have the power to disrupt that cycle of abuse and trauma and alienation, as opposed to continuing to pass on that harmful legacy. And I'm just happy as a dad that I've been able to break that pattern. And, child rearing is complex, it's difficult. Children need structure, they need discipline, they need to be accountable. But I think you can do that without ever striking a child. And we've been fortunate to have a healthy, emotionally evolved 10-year-old who has never had to face the brunt of a belt or a slap or a hit or mean words being said out of frustration. But it requires effort. It requires really understanding that they are at the early stages of their human journey and they don't understand the world the way that we understand it as adults. And it requires a greater deal of responsibility and patience as parents and a detachment from our ego. And, that's the way that I've approached parenting. That's the way I've approached healing. When it comes to my mom, is I think about what her journey has been. And those are only the things I know. I can't even imagine the things that I don't know that she's probably gone through. But being intentional about operating from a place of understanding as opposed to a place of resentment and bitterness.
Yeah. So you were a good student, you were an honor roll student, you wanted to be a doctor, but it just so happened that you were on the streets, right, in Detroit. And Detroit is how would you describe Detroit to a listener who is not familiar with Detroit, who is a foreign listener, let's say? How would you describe what kind of city is Detroit?
Yeah, Detroit is I love my hometown. I currently live in LA, but I truly, truly love my hometown. I think Detroit is a very complex city. It has had its battles and its struggle with drugs and crime, but it's also one of the most important cities when you think about the landscape that we call America and its contribution. It's the home of the auto industry. When you think about any automobile at this point, the origin story starts with Detroit, and it's something that Detroiters are very proud of. I mean, even in the midst of all this global warming and all the other environmental factors. But that aside, the ability to move throughout the world, that the genesis of that idea is rooted in, Detroit and, Motown music. I don't know anybody from any generation that hasn't heard at least one Motown song and hasn't been influenced by that cultural phenomenon that really changed the landscape of music and techno music. We are the birthplace of techno, which a lot of people don't realize. And, that gave birth to EDM music, which is a big deal in Europe and across the world. We have the largest Middle Eastern population outside of the Middle East that people aren't aware of. So the diversity of culture has been something I've known since a child. But the city has undergone some very tough times, with the fallout from the crack cocaine era to the bankruptcy and the recession. And the thing that I always smile about is just the resiliency of the people and the communal nature of Detroit. It feels like a Southern, it has a Southern charm, but an Eastern grit. A northern, a northeastern kind of grit to it that really meshes up into this wonderful, warm, hustle-oriented community. And so I just grew up in the midst of all that. I grew up in the middle of white flight. We were the first Black family on our block. And by the time I was 10 or 11 years old, that neighborhood had dramatically changed as many other neighbors we grew up with moved out. But it was also during the time with the influx of crack cocaine, and it devastated, our neighborhood. I watched this neighborhood go from beautiful manicured lawns, and most of the families there were, kind of like mothers and fathers were present, and working class, some middle class. And, I watched that change over the years, and it was very difficult to even come back home and see the devastation that was left behind as people fled to the outer suburbs. But the city is bouncing back. The people who have been there for years, they still are finding ways to, create community and create family dynamics that, are resilient and promising. So, that's kind of like my hometown in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can feel the warmth and the admiration that you have for your town, for your birthplace. So at age 14, you run away from home. What happens on the streets?
Yeah, when I ran away, I was a very naive kid, and I thought that one of my friend's parents would just take me in and raise me with the love, warmth, and affection that I think children are deserving of. And unfortunately, like many, young teenagers who flee their homes, I got seduced into the drug culture at that time, and I experienced all the horrors that came with that culture from the time I was 14 to 19. And, and again, I write about the fuller story in my first book, which, I think is a great way to, bring people into the insights of the new book as they get a chance to learn that story of what I had to navigate as a teenager. And, very tough circumstances. I was naive. I didn't have any sense of what the streets really were like. And, I experienced all the horrors that come with that, but I was, I'm fortunate in a sense to now be able to express a deeper understanding of that environment and that world that I had to navigate as a teenager.
Did your parents look for you?
I definitely know that my dad looked for me. I think my mom kind of had a mindset of like, eventually he'll come home. And there were moments when I did return home, but the difficult thing is once you experience that adult world drug culture, it's hard to, readjust to life as a kid because so many of the experiences were very adult oriented, unfortunately. So I had an accelerated maturation process as a result of being in this very unhealthy, very toxic adult culture.
And you lose your innocence, you lose your childhood, and a lot of things you lose in that process as well.
Absolutely. When I talk to people about working with young teenagers who have been, whether it's seduced into drug culture, whether they've run away from home. We know human trafficking is a reality now. And oftentimes the victims of that trafficking are young teenage girls and young teenage boys. And, the impact that has had in the world of sex trafficking, when we think about these kids, they truly are kids, and a lot of times, especially if you're a Black male, people don't want to identify you as a kid the way that other kids are privileged to have long into their, late teenage years and early 20s. And I just think it's important to recognize that these are kids who, in most cases, have been through very traumatic events that led them down that path.
Yeah. And you wrote in this book that you attempted suicide at age 16.
Yeah. And I think, talking about suicide very openly was very scary because as a society, we haven't created space for young people to talk about the things that lead to them wanting to take their lives. And, I'm sure over, the last almost 2 years now, there's been an uptick in teenage suicides and definitely an uptick in suicide, attempts by young Black boys. And so to be able to speak to that was, first of all, I just feel fortunate to have the words to express what the experience was, but also have the wisdom to recognize that it's a value add to society when we're creating spaces for people to have honest conversations about what their difficult moments are.
Now that you are a parent, your parenting story is extremely interesting because at age 19, you commit a second-degree murder, you end up in prison, and your son is born. And that's how you step into fatherhood, a kid yourself, right? who matured prematurely, lost his childhood, and you had this distant relationship, imagined, I guess, relationship with your son. But now you are a father to a 10-year-old boy, and you are very present, very conscious. You're raising him differently. So you had this interest. It's very interesting as a person, that I find that very interesting, that you had two fatherhoods basically strikingly different from one another, and they both changed you as a person. But now that you're raising your son, with this conscious, loving warmth and presence and authentic parenting, well, however we want to call it, my listeners know, what is it that you think kids need from their parents? What is it that you wanted from your parents? Now that you know what, I'm sure you're giving it to your son. I want you to speak about that. Like, kids don't need that much, right? They don't want that much. If you were received blank, what would that been, and how would that have changed maybe your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I think about the true needs of children, I don't think they're dissimilar from the needs of adults, in a sense that human connection is super important. Affirmation is truly integral to a child developing a healthy outlook on who they are in the world. For me specifically as a dad, I think one of the greatest responsibilities and the greatest gifts that I can give my sons are full access to all of their emotions. I think it's my greatest responsibility that my sons see that I can express all of the things I feel: joy, laughter, sadness, fear. And so that he'll be able to navigate the world knowing that these things are just part of the human experience. And so, when I think about the greatest gifts parents can give their children, I can't speak for mothers. I think that, at least in my experience, Sekou's mom, Ebony, and I, we parent different. We have the foundational building blocks of parenting are very much aligned. But we're also two very different human beings, and the way that we think about things, the way that we feel about things, they're oftentimes expressed differently. So I can look at some things that she does in their relationship and the uniqueness of that relationship. And I know that there's things that he gets from her that dad can provide, and it's perfectly okay. It's really one of the things that make co-parenting special, is that, there's very specific things that he just needs from mom. But there's also things that he needs from dad. And they're more than just a sense of being protected or being provided for. There are certain conversations he wants to specifically have with me. There's a kind of affection that I provide that's different from the affection that his mother provides. And so what I would say to parents is, first of all, recognize that your children come here as full human beings. They're their own human beings. They're going to have their own journey. Don't project onto them your failed dreams or the things that you wish you could have did or would have done if you had the support, and be really present to just allowing them to blossom into the fullness of their curiosity, the fullness of their intelligence, their creativity, and their ability to just be. So to me, a lot of parenting is really just getting out of the way, removing our ego, allowing them to have their own human experience, and to just be supportive. Like, children need to know that they're heard, to know that their feelings are considered, and they definitely need to be affirmed and have real access to affection.
Yeah, I like that you write about that, about crying in your book. There's a whole letter about that to your sons, which I found very touching. And you stated that you had lost the ability to cry for many years. When did you regain that ability to cry again?
Yeah, it was one of those things where, as I was navigating my incarceration and navigating forgiveness and empathy and compassion, it was alarming to me that I had not cried in a very long time. And what I came to understand is that, my childhood in my young teenage and formative years was so traumatic that, that ability to express sadness had been suffocated by the rewarding experience of being able to express anger. And especially as a Black boy growing up in tough circumstances, anger is oftentimes rewarded as the only acceptable emotion to express. And that was, when I had that epiphany, it was frightening to because I think that the ability to express sadness is such an integral part of what it means to be human. And it wasn't until I was on a visit, it was toward the end of my incarceration. I probably had, 16 to 17 years in, and I was on a visit with a friend, and she asked me, what did I really desire to experience upon my release? And I talked to her about how much I wanted to be a father. And as I began to express, my feelings around fatherhood and what I wanted to contribute to my oldest son, Jay's life, I just, felt the tears burst forward. And she was alarmed because we was in a prison visiting room, and she thought that would threaten my safety if other men saw me crying, because they can interpret that as weakness. And to me, while I took her concerns to heart, I knew that the potential other outcome was that other men could embrace that, hey, we were in a very, very hard environment, very barbaric, very anti-human, and it's really hard, and it was sad, and it's heartbreaking when you give up so much of your life, especially your most promising years, to that environment, and that you yearn for something so deeply that it makes you sad. And that yearning was to be a real dad. And so it was joyful because to me, that was the greatest expression to let me know I was still in touch with my humanity.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. So again, you ran away from home at 11. At 14, you're dealing drugs, you're doing drugs. At 17, you get shot, right? On the street.
Yes, and I write about that in the first book as well.
I know I'm jumping through your story because I want the listener to get the full story. So you get shot on the street. What happens? Because there's a reason why I'm asking all these questions. I'm going to bring it all back together.
Yeah, no, I truly appreciate that. One of the things is that I, at this point in my life, in my career, and where I'm at as a dad, a lot of my focus isn't so much on those traumatic experiences as it is on, where I'm at, at this point in my life and what's really important. But to speak to that, that being shot as a teenager, as a kid, it's very traumatic, and it's something that we don't think about, especially here in America when it comes to Black boys, is the high levels of gun violence that exist in our community and a long-term impact. And the short version is that 16 months later, after I shot and tragically caused a man's death and was sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. And, again, which I write about in the first book, and people can read that if they really want to go on that particular part of my journey. But it's something that I think is really important, when we're talking about the raising of kids in America, with all of the violence that we see, whether it's inner city violence or whether it's the suburban violence we see where kids are shooting up schools. And, it's easy to define those kids based on those experiences. But what I would hope is that parents really stop and pause for a minute and think that, no kid wakes up out of nowhere and just says, I want to go shoot up a school and kill my classmates or my teacher or shoot somebody in the community. Typically, those decisions are rooted in childhood trauma that has gone untreated.
Yeah. So that was a big trauma for you. At 17, you get shot and, you were on the streets. You didn't even have support, family or anything like that. And then, of course, as a young teen, impulsive, you want to be the powerful one now. It just all makes sense, right? That you shot someone now. And have you read the book, What Happened to You, by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry? It's about trauma.
Yeah, I've actually read. I'm actually in the book. So yeah, I've read. I haven't finished reading all of it, but Yeah,
Be-
it's a great
be-
book.
because that's the question we have to ask, right? What happened to you? Not
Absolutely.
why did you did this? When was the first time you heard about trauma in your entire journey? Because you were not
Yeah.
provided any mental health, any counseling, anything after you got shot, which was a pretty traumatic experience. I'm interested. When was the first time that you even discovered that there's such thing as adverse childhood experiences or trauma?
Yeah, I was probably in my 20s when I first even began to understand there was language for what happened to me and many other young men in our childhood. And, even growing up in the community where gun violence was at a, ultra heightened level, there just was no talks of mental health treatment. There was no talks of these events as traumatic. There was no talks of children growing up in these highly volatile environments experiencing PTSD. So I didn't learn a lot of that language until I was incarcerated. And it was well into my incarceration. I think I was reading some books by Dr. Amos Wilson when he's talked about Black on Black violence and its root causes and, the systemic racism that leads to the lack of treatment. When I think about my experience when I was shot at 17, I think about systemic racism that didn't allow the doctors and caretakers to even see me as a child. They made snap judgments that were rooted in their own biases, for our community. And when you think about the level of gun violence in the Black community, the fact that it hasn't been treated as a mental health crisis, it just speaks volumes about the racial systems that exist. When people are talking about systemic racism, we're not talking about individual white people as being racist. We're talking about the system that ignores large segments of society through conscious and unconscious bias, because the narrative around Black boys has been such that we've only been defined through our worst moments and not our, contributing moments. And so for me, when I think about my learning of trauma, like I should have learned that the day I got shot, or the first time I was struck, or the first time I was beat. Someone should have been saying, hey, here's a resource to help you unpack that harm has been done to you. And so, unfortunately, I had to learn kind of on my own while I was in prison.
Mm. Yeah, writing, journaling, reading, it seems like they helped you in prison. And I just can't wrap my head around the fact that you were in solitary confinement for cumulatively 7 years, which is like the harshest form of punishment. And you write that beautifully in one of your letters. It's titled Isolation. For me, in this book, that was my favorite letter in the first one, which is really poignant. And if we had 3 hours, I would ask you to read from your own book, from that first letter, which was very gripping. I was sitting on the edge of my seat reading, and it captures beautifully all the themes of your story in one letter, right? Wow. Also, what Black men and Black boys go through. It was really, really powerful. Yeah,
Thank you for saying it.
Yeah, it's such a shame. I used to work in a correctional facility for juvenile delinquents, so I am very passionate about reform and changing that system and what I've seen there. I mean, I have a whole story. I don't think I've ever shared on the podcast about that part of my life. I did make some changes, in that system. It was in Armenia. And because of that work, I received a scholarship from the US State Department to come to the United States. So I'm very passionate about this topic. It's, very dear to my heart. But that's a whole nother podcast. But how did you manage to keep sane in that environment?
Yeah, I would say, I was really fortunate to be literate for one. Being able to read was a saving grace for me on so many levels. But I attribute a lot of it to just having incredible mentors while I was inside. And these are men who are serving life sentences. Many of these men have been in prison for, at this point, 5 decades. Some of them have died in prison, and most of them will likely die in prison unless, these brutal, archaic laws are changed. But these incredibly beautiful men saw something redemptive in me, and they guided me to books. And those books just really awakened in me a sense of purpose and really gave me an opportunity to look into the lives of other people who had navigated difficult experiences. In the new book, I talk about Anne Frank. I talk about Nelson Mandela, especially in that chapter on isolation and how it creates this kind of family who have gone through, some of the most unconscionable experiences, that you can imagine. But for me, the way that I navigated it was through reading and writing and just having great mentors and shockingly like humor. I think you can't survive the craziness and madness of prison without a sense of humor, whether it's humor at the absurd or just the humor of hearing other stories retold by the incredible men who tell stories as a way of remaining connected to a sense of their humanity. Because oftentimes all we have to reflect on is those human moments of the past and not the barbaric experiences that we were, rooted in the moment.
Yeah, I heard you talk about the specific rat, that there was this pet rat in prison. That was kind of funny. But what I'm interested is, Shaka, I mean, you've been through a lot, even though your story is one of redemption and victory, and it's very inspiring and empowering. It is the trauma that it lives with you. Is it haunting you? Do you have nightmares? How does trauma show up in your life now? Have you done healing? What have you done? Because the thing, your life is very different now, but that's history is in your cells. It's in you, it's in your body, it's in your nervous system. So does it show up? How does it show up? And what have you done to heal yourself?
Yeah, I think healing is really a journey, and the thing about, when you spent nearly 2 decades in prison, you don't heal from that overnight, and especially when you spent 7 years incarcerated. And it shows up in many ways. It took me a while to be comfortable in public spaces, to have people stand over my shoulder, to have people randomly touch me, be in close proximity. Those are just like the kind of visceral reactions to freedom that I experienced. But it's also the internal conversation, the dialogue that I'm constantly challenged of, and the sad thing is that society never lets you forget where you've been. We live in a society that's very voyeuristic. We live in a society that's very judgmental. We live in a society that continues to punish you long after you've served your sentence. And so sometimes those things are triggering, and other times they're more manageable, but I practice mindfulness, I meditate, I'm very conscious of who I am as a person. Journaling, writing has been very therapeutic. I talk to other system impacted people. I try to read resources that are healing and anecdotal. So there's just tons of things that I'm constantly doing. I've been to therapy, but as I mentioned before, healing is a journey, and it's not a kind of one-off. And, in my life now, oftentimes, and sadly, I think it's just part of American culture. I'm not sure about the rest of the world, but sometimes we think that when people become successful in whatever ways we're measuring success, we think that's a cure-all to things they've gone through in real life. And it's not. Those are just the physical, tangible evidence that we've done something in the world, but it doesn't, help, or it doesn't heal the things that require internal processes to heal. So I just try to focus on being present, when I'm triggered. I try to monitor how much I reflect back on parts of my past. In this new book, I get a chance to really talk about what that did. There's a chapter called The Ford Taurus. And in that chapter, I really talk about how the retelling of traumatic events, the way that impacted my life at the time. And so I monitor it. I'm more aware of it. I choose not to talk about some things when I don't want to talk about them. And And I think it's important for anybody who's been through any traumatic experience to be intentional about protecting yourself and knowing that it's okay to say, today isn't a good day to talk about these things. And that's anybody. I just think it's important for us to start having more intentionality around honoring our humanity and being protective of our inner experience.
Yeah, there were two stories that you write about how you were triggered. One is with your older son, Jay, and the second story was when the policeman stopped you. Not stopped you, you were in your car. I just couldn't believe the story that I was reading. I just couldn't believe what I was reading. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's your life. You can, and you wrote about that on book tours you would, you became exhausted eventually by telling the same story of trauma, and it can reactivate, right? It could be very painful. For people it's very inspirational, but what are you going through when you're telling and retelling the story? I think is I'm glad you made that decision. How would you describe yourself as a parent today? What kind of a parent are you? If I were to ask Sekou, how would he describe you? Give me 5 adjectives.
So Sekou is one of the greatest cheerleaders ever.
Is he part of your healing too? I think he is, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he's just a beautiful force of nature, but he would probably describe me as very supportive. He's all, funny, thoughtful, kind, loving. He's always like, Dad, you're so dope. And, I appreciate how you support me. And it's really powerful to hear that from your child, when there's nothing attached to, hey, Dad, you're cool. Can I borrow your car keys? Hey, Dad, I love you. Or you're so loving. Can I have this treat? It just comes out of nowhere sometimes. He just comes up and hugs me randomly and just like, Dad, you're so amazing. And, he's full of affirmations. So the way that I would describe myself is thought evolved, emotionally accessible, affectionate, curious, just fully present. I'm just a fully present dad.
That's the same person you were when you were 17, 19, 14, 11, 10, right? Except life hardens you. Your story is very powerful and inspirational, and you're touching many hearts, with your work, with your mentoring. It's very wonderful to hear that. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I can talk to you, for hours. This book is very beautiful, very moving, very beautiful. The letters. I'm curious, does your son know? Your sons have read? Your older son is what? Probably how old is he? 30?
So Jay is 30 now and Sekou just turned 10. Sekou has read some of the letters. Some of them he still has some maturing and growing to do before he gets to those. Mm-hmm. But at 10 years old, his reading comprehension level is through the roof. So he's just he gives great feedback. And, he found the story about sneakers really funny because I'm still love sneakers to this day. And
that's why you like it, because you were traumatized by that experience. No, I'm joking.
Yeah. No, I was traumatized though, and I realized I messed up those great sneakers. But Jay has decided that he's not ready to read it, which is perfectly fine. And, the way I think about this book and the way I thought about it when I was writing it, my dad is a community mentor. He talks to all of the sons in the community, old, young, in between. And, the way that I think about my sons is they embody all of the sons of society. And so as much as these letters are directed toward them specifically, in general, I think these letters are going to touch society in a way that just shifts the conversation around men and boys and fathers and sons.
And what does it mean? This is the final question, I promise. What does it mean to you now that you broke this cycle of trauma, abuse? You did break that cycle. Like looking back at your life, at your parents' life and yours and the legacy you inherited, like what does it mean? What's the significance for you, the value?
Yeah, I would say for me, when I think about my work in the world as a writer and the stories that I'm able to have and share with men, the value is seeing so many men open up to the idea that vulnerability, that love, that emotional accessibility are truly the gifts we give to ourselves and by extension to those we love and care about. And so seeing so many men respond to the book has been just incredibly inspiring and beautiful, but also seeing the women who come to me and say, I think I understand my dad better. I think I understand my husband better. I really want to spend time learning from my grandfather. I mean, it's just the most beautiful thing because while men historically have dominated, society in the ways that are metric driven when we're talking about salaries and we're talking about employment opportunities and career opportunities and all the things that we use to measure success, prosperity, and power. What has been absent from that is the true essence of what it means to be a man. To be thought evolved, emotionally evolved, spiritually evolved. That conversation hasn't been had at scale. And I think now is a great time to have it because if we truly are going to change the world, if we truly are going to create a better experience for our current lives, but as well as future generations, we have to create space for men to have healthy, emotionally vulnerable conversations around manhood and more importantly around fatherhood.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much again for joining me today. It was truly an honor and pleasure, and the time flew by very quickly.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor, and I feel the same way. I can talk to you all day. I think you have just a ton of wisdom around parenting and incredibly insightful and thoughtful questions. So truly was an honor to be here. I hope your audience enjoys. I definitely hope they go out and buy the book. And I hope that the book is just another tool to put in their toolbox of parenting and hopefully is helpful.
Yeah, I think I'm going to buy a bunch of copies and keep it in my office and give it to all my Black male clients, which is, I work with a lot of them. And their story is always the same. And I'm sure it's always the same story. It's just very, very empowering to hear your story. And I think this is going to help a lot of people, this book. It's very honest.
No, thank you so much. And I highly encourage, to give it to your white male clients as well. I think, when we're talking about police in America, we're talking about, the social realities that we face with. I think there are so many things that white dads and white men specifically will learn from the book that will allow them to open up and be honest about what privilege really looks like. I think when we're having these conversations around race and, gender equity in the world, I think this is the type of book that is inviting. It doesn't repel white men in the way that a lot of things do, because it's really an invitation to understand the nuances, And I think of the chapter, when I'm talking about the night of cleaning the poop out of my puppy's cage, I think that is a chapter that really will help white men understand what we're really talking about when we're talking about police brutality, that is deeper than these clips where we're trying to justify why an officer would shoot. It's a more nuanced conversation we should be having. So highly encourage you to encourage them to go out and buy it and read the book as well.
Yeah, well said. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it. I love hearing from you. Are you enjoying the show? What are some of your recent favorite episodes and topics? I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, there is a free tool on the contact page of my website, authenticparenting.com/contact. If you want to connect with your fellow listeners, talk about the episodes, ask questions, and get support with parenting, join the Authentic Parenting Community private Facebook group. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. It's very easy to do. It takes a few seconds, but it's very helpful. And of course, I love reading what you have to say about the show. You can rate the show on Spotify. If you happen to listen on Spotify, that's a new feature. And if you want to say thank you for the amazing content that you're getting from the podcast, consider becoming a patron on patreon.com. With a small monthly contribution, you can support your favorite show and get supporter-only content, benefits, and exclusive access to me. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and elsewhere. And you can connect with me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use and somewhat enjoy. Until next week, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.